Hi, Year 11. Again, sorry that I'm not with you. For the rest of the week, I will be doing these videoed lessons. So when I come back next week, when I'm back on Monday, we should be able to get straight on in planning and sort of getting on with your Romeo and Juliet essay. In these videos, I'm giving you all of the direct instruction you need to get this essay planned. So as long as you are cooperating with the cover teacher, being sensible human beings, reading what I am putting on the screen, listening to my explanations, writing notes, selecting your quotations, then you should be absolutely fine. I am on my emails if anybody would like to email me directly with any of their work or with any sort of questions. Please do feel free to do that. And I'm just sorry that I'm not with you this week. It is somewhat frustrating. So we're going to begin, as always, with some vocabulary. We're going to recall two words that we would have looked at last year when we studied Romeo and Juliet for the first time. Those are duel. So think, what is a duel? And why does Tybalt challenge Romeo to a formal duel? What were the rules of a duel? Then we have flamboyant. So think to yourself, what does it mean to be flamboyant? And how has Mercutio been presented as a flamboyant character in the play? Then finally, if you want to challenge yourselves, you could argue that Tybalt and Mercutio have similar characteristics, but where Mercutio is flamboyant, Tybalt is uptight with a keen sense of honour. Why do you think Shakespeare has chosen to present the two characters in this way? So why do we have this real contrast with the fact that Mercutio is very flamboyant, Tybalt's very uptight, yet they have this similar truculence, this similar aggression to them? Why is that a potentially very, very dodgy combination? And why do you think Shakespeare's presented them in this way? So if the cover teacher could pause the video now and give yourselves about 3-ish minutes to have a go at answering these 3 questions. And then when you unpause the video, I'll give you some information. So a duel is essentially something you could legally and formally challenge someone to if you feel like they've wronged you in some way. It's not something we can do anymore. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But it is something that they could do in Shakespeare's time. And actually, you know, it's only really been out of practice for the last 100 years or so. So what we have here is we have Tybalt, who is offended at the fact that Romeo snuck into the Capulet party, and Tybalt feels that Romeo has dishonoured the Capulet family. To get revenge, to restore his family's honour, Tybalt has written a letter to Romeo and Romeo's father, formally delivered it, and challenged Romeo to a fight. Now, duels could often be to first blood, so the winner would be the person that injured the other one first, or to the death. That seems very extreme, and it is, but wasn't uncommon. And what this letter would have is a time and a place for the duel. And you would be expected to, you know, say yes, you would fight this person, or you would be considered a coward and you would be considered dishonouring your own family. So it was this real sort of code of honour then between these sort of upper class families at the time. What we see in Act 3, Scene 1, the scene we're going to look at today, or the first half at least, we have Tybalt turning up expecting to fight Romeo. And then, as you'll remember from last year, it all going horribly wrong. So flamboyant then. If somebody is flamboyant, then they are very over the top. They are very extroverted. And essentially what we see here, sorry, I've just noticed that my mum's dog has now got sellotape in its mouth. So I'm just going to go remove the sellotape from the mouth of the dog. Oh, that's what you get from working from home. Right, sellotape has now been retrieved from the mouth of the dog, who particularly likes eating socks for some reason. But, you know, that's dogs for you. Anyway, if you are flamboyant, you are very over the top and you're very extroverted. You like to draw a lot of attention to yourself. Now, obviously, this sums up Mercutio's character. Mercutio is flamboyant. Mercutio does like drawing attention to himself. Mercutio is always antagonizing and winding people up to get a reaction out of them. And Mercutio is every bit as fond of a fight as Tybalt. And considering these two characters are going to clash in the scene we're looking at today, we can imagine why that's going to go horribly wrong. So Shakespeare, to look at our want to aim high question, Shakespeare has chosen to present Tybalt and Mercutio in this way to build up this dramatic tension. In the last scene that you would have looked at on Friday, Act 2, Scene 4, we see Mercutio has no fear of Tybalt, and in fact has no real respect for him as a fighter. He thinks he's too effeminate, and he is too worried about following the sort of proper fencing form, much like a dancer. And we know that Mercutio probably isn't afraid to fight a little bit dirty. We also know that they are both as aggressive and both as truculent as one another. So Shakespeare's really presenting the characters as having these differences, but also this sort of core similarity. So when they meet in the scene we're going to look at today, that tension and that drama is really heightened for the audience. So today we're going to analyse how Tybalt is presented at the start of Act 3, Scene 1. I'm going to ask the cover teacher to just pause the video a second just to let you write that down. So by the end of the lesson, you will have revised how Tybalt was presented at the start of Act 3, Scene 1. We're going to look at Act 3, Scene 1 in two parts. So we're going to look at it today, and then in your next lesson, we'll look at the second half because it's quite a big and important scene. We're going to think about why Shakespeare chooses to present Tybalt in this way. Now, all through these videos, we've looked at the extracts from the scenes Tybalt's in. We've identified our quotations, we've exploded them, and we've thought about why Shakespeare has chosen to present Tybalt in this way. And it's that focus on Shakespeare's intentions and the purpose of Tybalt as this sort of antagonist in the play, this person who perpetuates or continues this cycle, generational cycle of violence and hatred. Tybalt is very much the sort of catalyst or the archetypal person that has just continued this grudge. And it is why it's going to take something as extreme as Romeo and Juliet's double suicide at the end of the play to end that grudge because of people like Tybalt. And everything in your essay really needs to link back to the purpose, of his character, which is why I've been talking about it so much. So just to fill in the gaps then between Act 2, Scene 4, which is where we looked at last lesson. So the next scene, Act 2, Scene 5, the nurse returns to Juliet after speaking to Romeo in Act 2, Scene 4 about the wedding. Juliet is impatient for an answer. She wants to know, has Romeo managed to organise the wedding? But the nurse is sort of antagonising Juliet by not giving her an answer straight away. She says, "Oh, my bones ache, I'm too tired, I'm out of breath." But really, Shakespeare's just doing that to, again, heighten the tension. So after they both get annoyed with one another and they sort of bicker a bit, the nurse eventually reveals that if Juliet tells her parents she's going to confession with Friar Lawrence, then secretly Romeo will be waiting there for her, where they will then be married. Now, they all would have been Catholic at the time this was written, and confession is something that a Catholic regularly does. They go to church and they confess their sins to a priest, and a priest then sort of gives them certain tasks or prayers they have to say that will make their sins forgiven. So Juliet is going to sort of sneak over, well, not sneak, she's going to lie to her parents, say she's going to confession with Friar Lawrence, but actually Romeo will secretly be there and Friar Lawrence is going to marry them in secret. Now, this is absolutely not what was supposed to happen in these days. Juliet does not get free choice on who she marries. That's why Paris has gone to Capulet rather than Juliet himself. Women didn't have that sort of autonomy and power over their own lives in those days, and in some cultures still don't today. So Juliet is not only breaking sort of typical gender conventions here in taking her love life into her own hands, it's illegal what they're doing. So again, quite a shock to that little girl we met in Act 1, Scene 3 that had never thought of marriage and was very obedient. She's essentially lying to her parents' faces and going to marry this guy she's just met. So somewhat of a change there. So then in Act 2, Scene 6, the final scene in Act 2, Romeo and Juliet, accompanied by the nurse as their sort of witness, meet up at Friar Lawrence's cell, and he marries them both. As he does so, and this is such an important part of the play, he cautions them both to love moderately, otherwise, like gunpowder, love can consume you. It's this wonderful language, sort of rich language here, whereas essentially Shakespeare's being very clever, and he's foreshadowing the fact that Romeo and Juliet, unsurprisingly, do not listen to this advice. They do not love each other moderately. Their love for one another, like gunpowder, does consume and ultimately destroy them, which is, of course, foreshadowing these tragic, fated deaths at the end of the play. But it is a very ironic little moment there, because remember, the audience have this dramatic irony throughout the play. We know in the prologue Romeo and Juliet are going to die, and that's their fate. So the fact that, you know, they've literally just met, they haven't even known each other 24 hours and they're getting married, there's nothing moderate about that. And Friar Lawrence, stupidly, is obviously being party to this. They couldn't have got married if it wasn't for Friar Lawrence. So you could argue that this advice to love moderately comes a little bit too late when you choose to marry people after they haven't even known each other for 24 hours. But anyway, that is the end of Act 2. So that then brings us to Act 3, Scene 1. Now, it's really important that we're told this is in a public place. Now, the reason why it's important that this is a public place is there is going to be a fight that's going to break out. And overhanging this whole scene is this decree by the prince at the start of the play, when sorry, my mum's chucking a ball for the dog in the background, which is right. The dog has already tried to eat sellotape. I'm so sorry. Sorry. See, last videos I did, it was my son screaming for party rings, so it's the dog now. Anyway, it's important that we realise that this is in a public place, because overhanging all of this, we have the decree from the prince that anybody who is caught fighting, doesn't matter who you are, you will be executed. And that threat is hanging over this whole scene. So we have Mercutio and Benvolio, along with just some sort of servants or whatever. And Benvolio, bless his reasonable little heart, says, "I pray thee, I beg you, good Mercutio, let's retire, so let's go home. The day is hot, the Capulets are abroad, and if we meet, we shall not escape a brawl, a fight. For now, these hot days is the mad blood stirring." Now, this is more really important foreshadowing here. Benvolio, the voice of reason amongst his generation, is saying, look, let's go home. The day's hot. There are Capulets around. And actually, everyone's sort of agitated and everyone's annoyed. And if we meet, there's no way there's not going to be a fight. We shouldn't be fighting. The prince has said it's not allowed. Let's just go home. Now, as always, if they'd listened to Benvolio, then no one would have died in this scene. But the trouble with this play is nobody listens to Benvolio. And that's why he's the only one that lives ultimately. And everyone else in his generation die because they just don't listen to reason. So Mercutio, rather than listen to reason, excuse me, decides to tease him. He says to Benvolio, "Thou art like one of those fellows that when he enters the confines of a tavern, a pub, claps me his sword upon the table and says, 'God send me no need of thee,' and by the operation of the second cup, draws it on the drawer when indeed there is no need." So he's basically saying to Benvolio, you're a hypocrite. Because you're like one of those people that goes to a pub, you know, puts his sword down and says, "Nope, not going to need you. I'm just here for a relaxing drink." But by the time he's had 2 pints of beer, he's on the table with his sword in hand, you know, threatening to stab someone. Now, that doesn't exactly sound like Benvolio, does it, from what we've seen? So we can infer from this that Mercutio is doing what Mercutio does best and just antagonizing Benvolio. So Benvolio says, "Am I like such a fellow? So what, am I really like that?" And Mercutio says, "Come, come, thou art as hot a Jack in thy mood as any in Italy, and as soon moved to be moody, and as soon moody to be moved." So he's like, yeah, no, you're, you know, as hot-tempered and sort of love a fight as much as anyone in Italy. Again, we're not sure we really believe Mercutio here. Nothing Benvolio has said or done so far leads us to that, but that's certainly Mercutio's opinion of it. I have cut out a little bit here, so if you're following it with your copies, there may be a little bit more of dialogue, but it wasn't really important. So Benvolio then says, and I were so apt to quarrel as thou art, any man should buy the fee simple of my life for an hour and a quarter. So it's basically saying to Mercutio, well, you know, if I loved quarreling, fighting as much as you, I'd be fighting every hour. There'd be a new person fighting. So he's sort of turning it back on Mercutio, really, and being like, no, you're the one that loves the fight. Again, this is all building up the tension, because suddenly Benvolio says, by my head, here come the Capulets. So he's spied Tybalt. So we see these sort of prediction that we've just seen about if they meet the Capulets, they won't escape a fight, is of course going to come true. And Mercutio says, by my heel, I care not. So Mercutio is not bothered that that Tybalt has just appeared. We know from the last scene, from Act 2, Scene 4, that Mercutio does not fear Tybalt, despite his reputation as being a really fantastic fighter. He, you know, already has that low opinion of him. So we have all of that dramatic tension from that scene building as well. So here comes Tybalt then, and here is where you may want to start thinking about the quotations that you're going to use. Tybalt says, follow me close, for I will speak to them. So he's talking to his sort of backup, if you like, the other Capulets that have arrived on scene with him. Gentlemen, good den, good day, a word with one of you. Now notice how he's speaking to them both, even Benvolio, who's his enemy, politely. He is trying to show that he is upholding the rules of the duel. The only person he has an issue with in this situation is Romeo. He's not looking to start a fight with Mercutio or Benvolio. Now, that's really, really important, actually. The fact that Tybalt, in terms of the tension of the scene, begins it behaving himself. And has obviously made the conscious decision to behave himself when it comes to anyone else that might get involved. Mercutio, however, being the flamboyant, hot-headed character that he is, refuses to keep it polite, and he starts antagonizing Tybalt. And but one word with one of us, couple it with something, make it a word and a blow. So a blow is obviously like, you know, a punch or a stab with their sword. So essentially, Mercutio is saying, well, if you want to have a word with one of us, if you want to speak to one of us, we'd rather fight you, basically. So it is Mercutio and not Tybalt who starts with the aggression in this scene. Tybalt is behaving himself at the moment, and it's Mercutio is the one that is antagonizing the situation. And Tybalt says, you shall find me apt enough to that, sir, and you will give me occasion. So he's saying, well, if you want to fight, you will find me apt enough, you will find me happy enough and capable enough of giving you a fight if you give me occasion, if you give me reason. Now, this is also important because Tybalt is saying, well, I'm more than capable and willing to fight you, but you've got to give me a reason. So he's managing somewhat to keep his calm, even though he would have really not been happy with Mercutio's disrespectful tone. We also need to remember that Mercutio is not a Montague. Mercutio is a relative of the prince. And whilst Mercutio may align himself with the Montagues due to his friendship with Benvolio and Romeo, Tybalt is going to be a little bit wary of sort of starting something with Mercutio unless Mercutio really pushes him to it. So in your analysis of this scene, it's important that, you know, Mercutio is the aggressor, at least at the start, not Tybalt is trying as much as he can to behave himself. Mercutio, refusing to let it go, says, could you not take some occasion without giving? So he's sort of saying, oh, well, surely you can find a reason to fight me. So he's refusing to let it drop. Now, Tybalt starting to get a little bit annoyed now, and Tybalt is now trying to antagonize Mercutio back. So they haven't actually come to blows yet, but they're sort of verbally sparring and fighting. So he says, Mercutio, thou consortest with Romeo. Now, consortest means associate with. You are associated with, you are friends with Romeo, is essentially what he means. However, the word consort can have multiple meanings here. Now, a consort could refer to a group of musicians that you would see, I don't know, at a ball, a bit like at the Capulet party the day before. There would have been a consort, a group of musicians. Now, musicians would be lower class, you know, people. So Mercutio gets very insulted or deliberately chooses to take the word consort in a negative way. Consort, and I doubt it's sort of got sexual overtones here, really, because there isn't any of that in the play between any of these male characters, really. But consort can also be sort of like another word for a mistress as well. So either way, Mercutio chooses to take it as an insult. So he says, consort, we can see the exclamation mark there. What? Does thou make us minstrels? Minstrels is a musician, like I said before. And thou make minstrels of us, look to hear nothing but discords. Now, he's continuing with the sort of musical metaphors here, really, because if you're saying a consort is a musician, Mercutio's saying, what, we're musicians then, we're, you know, peasants essentially. Discord is when you play two notes together, and rather than harmonize them, they make that they clash, basically. Here's my fiddlestick, here's that shall make you dance, zounds, consort. Now, when he says, here's my fiddlestick, again, he's actually brandishing his sword, but obviously fiddlestick, if you were a violinist, it would be what you would use to make, you know, the notes in your instrument. So he's sort of using music metaphors, essentially. But the long and the short of it is Mercutio is insulted. He draws his sword. And again, it's interesting that it's Mercutio who draws his sword first in this scene. Now, Benvolio, ever the voice of reason, says, we talk here in the public haunt of men. So everyone is around. We're in public, you idiots. Either withdraw unto some private place, so either go and fight in private and reason coldly of your grievances. So sit down and sort it out with words, or else depart, or else just walk away. So this is Benvolio's advice. Either go somewhere in private, talk it out, or walk away. Here, all eyes gaze on us. So Benvolio is very mindful of the prince's decree that if any of them fight, then they will be executed. So if Tybalt and Mercutio start fighting, then they could die. You know, they could be killed. And Benvolio is like, stop it, you know, just walk away. But Mercutio says, men's eyes were made to look, and let them gaze. I will not budge for no man's pleasure eye. Now, that last line perfectly sums up Mercutio. Mercutio is not going to do anything Mercutio does not want to do. He's like, you know, eyes were meant to look. That's their purpose. Let people look. I don't care. I will not move if I don't want to move. If I want to fight, I will fight, basically, and nothing you say or do is going to stop me. And unfortunately, when we look at the second half of the scene next lesson, we do see that those tensions do escalate. And what we're going to talk about in tomorrow's lesson is who is to blame for what happens in this scene. And a lot of that blame can lay at Mercutio's door, not just Tybalt. But we're going to sort of pick that up next lesson, really, when we look at the actual fight itself. So how is Tybalt presented at the start of Act 3, Scene 1? What I'd like you to do is, in that little bit we've just looked at today, pick 2 quotations and explode them in your books, making notes on how the language develops your impression of Tybalt's character. Now, by the time we get to the end of tomorrow's lesson, we will have looked at all of the quotations, all of the scenes that Tybalt's in. The final lesson this week will be you looking at all of those quotations that you've exploded and actually selecting the ones you're going to use in your essay. So you're not going to necessarily write about all of the quotations you've selected over the last few lessons, but instead it's giving you a bank to choose from. So pick 2, copy them out, explode them in your books, and make notes. How does the language develop your impression of Tybalt's character? So if the cover teacher wants to pause the video, give you about 5-ish minutes to do that, okay? And then you can move on to the next slide. So as we've done with all these lessons, we're now going to think about why Shakespeare chooses to present Tybalt in this way at the start of Act 3, Scene 1. Now, this scene is really important because it's a narrative turning point of the play. It's where the play turns from a comedy to a tragedy. Shakespeare builds upon the seeds he has sown in Act 1, Scene 1, Act 1, Scene 5, and Act 2, Scene 4, all of which has built to this confrontation in this scene. Mercutio plays a big role in heightening the tension of this scene. He is clearly in an antagonistic mood at the start of the scene, and we know from Act 2, Scene 4 that he has no respect or fear of Tybalt. Whilst he is currently on his best behaviour, it is clear that he will not put up with Mercutio's comments for long. You know, Tybalt, like I said, starts off this scene being very respectful, but he's not somebody that's going to put up with Mercutio insulting him before it will antagonise him into fighting him. Shakespeare's intention at the start of this scene is to use Mercutio and Tybalt to build dramatic tension ahead of Romeo's arrival, which we're going to look at tomorrow. By the time Romeo does arrive in the next section of the scene, both Tybalt and Mercutio are spoiling for a fight and tensions are high. So the final thing that I'd like you to do, well, two things. Firstly, I'd like you to go back to your exploded quotations and I'd like you to add in those notes about Shakespeare's intentions. Then finally, again, I'm not sure how much time you're going to have left over in the lesson, but if you do have some time left over, I'd like you to pick one of those exploded quotations and again, have a go at doing a practice mini PE paragraph, really analysing how the language has given you your impression of Tybalt and adding in all that information about Shakespeare's intentions. Why has he chosen to present Tybalt in this way? If anybody wants to take a photo of any of their paragraphs and wants to email them to me, I'm more than happy to sort of get back and give you some feedback on that until I can be back with you next week. Okay, so the cover teacher can pause the lesson, and for what's remaining of the lesson, that's what you can be focusing on. And remember, all of these notes you can use in your essay that we're going to be writing next week. Okay, so I'll see you next lesson.